Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Luis Ortiz has scored a unanimous decision win in New York against a game Christian Hammer in what was quite an interesting and fun fight. Better than advertised, Luis Ortiz and Christian Hammer really went at it in the first 4 or 5 rounds, and it was kind of a tale of two halves because those first, half a dozen rounds or so, 5 rounds, action-packed. The final 4 or 5 rounds, not so much, both visibly tired, both gassing, and there wasn't a lot of action in some of those later rounds. But Luis Ortiz on the scorecards, 100-90 and 99-91 on 2 of the cards. And I don't think those cards really represent how competitive it was, especially in that first half of the fight where Christian Hammer was really trying to put it on Luis Ortiz with the right hand and having some success. And the manner in how this fight played out, with Hammer having success in those rounds, but also Luis Ortiz looking a bit tired later in the fight and not really having as much gas in the tank, not really putting it on Christian Hammer. He was asked after the fight, did you hurt your left hand because you stopped using it, stopped throwing it as much? And he said, no, there was no problem. So some will say Luis Ortiz is looking all of his 39 years old. He's turning 40 very shortly. Okay, I'll go to some of the action here, a bit of a sum up and recap of some of what we saw there, because it was a tale of two halves. In the first round, Luis Ortiz came out behind the jab, as many of us would have expected. He was looking to use it as a rangefinder, to find a home for that left hand. And Christian Hammer signaled pretty early that he had come to fight. He was looking to land that right hand, and ultimately he would find a home, especially in the second round. And at this point, the fight was really heating up. There was a lot more action than I was expecting, I think many other people. Christian Hammer, even though he was getting touched up and hit to the body, he was getting hurt to the body too. He wasn't shelling up as he often has done in the past. He obviously thought that Luis Ortiz, was there to be taken, that he was vulnerable to some extent because he kept throwing and he was landing the right hand a couple of times, really hitting the mark, buzzing Ortiz. And there was actually a head clash in that second round. It wasn't immediately obvious, but the replay showed there was a head clash. Luis Ortiz's glove did touch the canvas, but it wasn't ruled a knockdown. But towards the end of that round, Ortiz hurt Hammer, and it was a very fun fight. And it continued throughout the next few rounds where Ortiz was really trying to unload on Christian Hammer, who was voluntarily going back and laying on the ropes and looking to counter Ortiz. And while that's a risky strategy against a guy like Luis Ortiz, who was landing body shots, he was getting around Christian Hammer's guard, he was finding a home for his uppercut, Hammer was actually having some success, and he was touching Luis Ortiz up with that right hand. He was landing it quite regularly through the first 4 or 5 rounds. And by this point, rounds 4 and 5, Ortiz, he looked to be clearly up on the scorecards. He was outworking Christian Hammer, who was almost exclusively looking for the right hand. His jab, compared to Luis Ortiz's, it was non-existent. Ortiz was using it, 30, 40 jabs around, whereas Hammer, he might sort of throw the arm out there, but it wasn't really a jab as such. Sometimes he was pushing Ortiz with it as well. But Ortiz did, to an extent, in that first half of the fight, look a little bit vulnerable because Hammer was finding a home for the right hand. But from here on out, it really started to become more of a boxing sort of clinic from Luis Ortiz. Hammer was gassing, and Ortiz, he was slowing down a touch too from round 6 onwards. But he was still boxing, using the jab, working the body, and there was some great body work in particular in round 6 and also in some of the latter rounds. But it was becoming clear from about round 8 onwards that Ortiz, he was really slowing down as well. He wasn't really throwing the left hand, and there wasn't a lot of action in the last few rounds. He did sort of rally in that final round, the 10th round, try to put it on Christian Hammer, but he couldn't get him out of there. And overall, he wasn't able to drop Christian Hammer in this fight, but visibly Christian Hammer was hurt to the body a number of times. Also, a couple of times Ortiz buzzed him when he clipped him upstairs, but Hammer finished the fight on his feet, losing a unanimous decision. And I'm not sure that Christian Hammer would be altogether happy with the scorecards. I mean, maybe you could have given him 3 rounds max, more likely 2, but yeah, it definitely was, for the most part, all Luis Ortiz behind, his jab, behind the body work. He was just more active than Christian Hammer. Hammer wasn't throwing enough punches to win rounds. He was looking for the right hand, and that was about it. And that became entirely predictable at different points, but he was having some success. After the fight, Luis Ortiz was asked, well, what do you make of your effort there? And he said it was a hard fight. It was a hard fight. And he was asked, did you hurt your hand because you didn't throw it much, from about the 6th or 7th round onwards? And he said, no. And later he said he wasn't disappointed with his performance. He did what he wanted to do. He used his boxing, and he added, I'm still ready at 40. Joshua Wilder, I'm ready. And so he'll be 40 at the end of this month, the end of March, and he still wants those top fights. And on the strength of what we saw in that fight, I think there will be a number of heavyweights who will go, okay, well, maybe it's time I take a calculated risk with Luis Ortiz, because it was another occasion, and we had that Deontay Wilder fight back in March 2018, where Luis Ortiz was visibly fading in the latter half of the fight. He looked pretty sharp early on, and he was really finding a home for some of his key and marquee punches. But towards the back end of the fight, he did, he was visibly gassing, and potentially someone with a bigger motor than Christian Hammer, who's a cut above where Hammer is in the pecking order in the heavyweight division, they may be able to take advantage of this. Overall, though, I thought it was a decent performance. Luis Ortiz did at times look very slick with what he was doing. It was very calculated, very deliberate, but there was also an air of vulnerability about him too. Hammer was finding that right hand more than I was expecting, and I'm sure more than Ortiz was expecting. His trainer, Herman Caicedo, had said that he thought Christian Hammer, once Ortiz started to find a home for his left hand and other punches, that he would shell up. And that's exactly what I was thinking based on some of Hammer's previous fights. But obviously he went for a different strategy. He clearly thought that Luis Ortiz was vulnerable and could be hit and could be hurt. And he went for it with the right hand, and he did have some success in this fight. And Hammer is not the biggest puncher in the heavyweight division, and some other guys out there who can land some punches, because Hammer also found a home for the left hook a few times as well. Some guys may fancy their chances against this version of Luis Ortiz, who may be slowing down now. Overall, it was a decent performance from Ortiz, and it was a fun fight, especially in that first 5 rounds or so. After that, it did kind of peter out into, not as much of a spectacle, maybe to what we would have expected the fight would have been like anyway. But actually, it was a decent fight overall. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.